a millionaire kicked his wife and newborn son out into the street. Days later, he found out they had been in a tragic accident, and the guilt he felt completely devastated him. Arthur had built his business empire thanks to his financial acumen and a competitive spirit that drove him never to settle for anything less than excellence. From a very young age, he had become a recognized figure in the corporate world, owning tech companies and luxury hotels. It was common to see him surrounded by advisors who, with serious and deferential expressions, nodded at his every word during press conferences or meetings with investors. He always appeared impeccably dressed, wearing tailored suits, exclusive watches, and exuding a confidence so strong it was almost intimidating to those who dared to question him. On more than one occasion, Arthur had been seen at lavish parties, toasting with champagne so expensive that most people were unaware of its existence. At charity galas, his name often came up in speeches of gratitude, since he regularly made generous donations that, in addition to prestige, gave him a certain aura of nobility. However, behind that philanthropic image lay a controlling nature, obsessed with maintaining absolute power over every aspect of his life and his company. When his long workdays ended, Arthur returned to a minimalist-style mansion on the outskirts of the city. At dusk, the lights from the large windows highlighted the sculptures and artworks that adorned its vast foyer, which opened onto elegant staircases leading to the private quarters. That home, so modern and expansive, seemed designed to host dozens of guests. Nevertheless, it was almost always empty, because Arthur did not enjoy family gatherings or spending much time with friends. To him, that place was more a symbol of success than a refuge for relaxation. His wife, Lucia, was the complete opposite. She came from a middle-class family with simple traditions and a deep love for warmth in the home. The mansion overwhelmed her, even though she had found it dazzling at first. When she married Arthur, she was captivated by the promise of a life full of luxury, but she also hoped to build a home in the traditional sense of the word. With the arrival of their son, Jacob, her wish for a close-knit family grew stronger in her heart. Yet instead of Arthur's companionship, she found herself alone in a house that was far too big. Lucia's day usually began very early. She rose before dawn and tended to Jacob's cries, as he demanded his bottle with gentle babbles and little kicks. Between diapers and lullabies, she would place him in the main living room, close to the windows, so he could bask in the light filtering through the white curtains. There, she showed him simple toys that stood in stark contrast to the luxurious decor around them. Lucia spent most of her day caring for him, singing lullabies and silently checking her phone, hoping for a message from Arthur, letting her know he would be home early for dinner. In the first few weeks after Jacob's birth, Lucia hadn't felt Arthur's absence so keenly. He was in the final stages of completing an international merger that, he told her, would secure the family's future. However, time went by and the negotiations seemed endless. It became increasingly difficult for her to hold on to the hope that, very soon, he would get used to his new role as a father. At night, when the massive doors of the mansion opened to announce Arthur's arrival, Lucia would hurry to meet him, holding the baby in her arms. But she rarely received a warm embrace or words of encouragement. He merely greeted her with a nod, excusing himself by saying he had urgent business calls to make and would lock himself in his study. From there, Lucia could hear him speaking loudly about budgets, stocks, and contracts. Meanwhile, she waited, hoping that eventually he would come out to spend a few minutes with Jacob before the baby fell asleep. The few conversations they managed to have revolved around the company. Whenever Lucia tried to talk about Jacob's progress or mention that the baby already recognized his voice, Arthur would nod absent-mindedly, more concerned about missing a call from whatever investor he was courting at the time. Lucia began to sense, like a quiet voice inside her, that she wasn't getting the support or attention she deserved in her new life as a mother. Whenever Lucia found a moment, she would propose that Arthur take at least one afternoon off to spend time with the baby. She dreamed of taking him to the park together, breathing in the fresh air and watching Jacob's reactions to the outside world. but she almost always received the same reply. "Tomorrow, I'll rearrange my schedule, and we'll do it." A phrase repeated again and again, without ever coming to pass. Days turned into weeks, and Lucia began to notice a widening gap between them. In addition to the emotional distance, the mansion's silence increased her sense of isolation. Although she had household staff to help with domestic chores, she didn't interact with them much. After all, they were Arthur's employees and stayed in their own lane, never daring to get involved. She needed her husband, not an army of assistants. Thus, the seeds of conflict took root with every missed connection. Some nights, Lucia would wait for Arthur with dinner prepared, while Jacob slept in his crib. Yet the food grew cold, and she ended up eating alone, wondering at what point in their marriage business had begun to take precedence. The next day, Arthur would apologize in a distant manner, blaming contract deadlines and financial pressure. Sometimes, Lucia begged not for trips or expensive outings, but simply for some quality time together with Jacob. He justified himself by insisting on the need to keep the company afloat so that their child could have the best possible future. In Arthur's eyes, his primary responsibility was to provide and increase the family fortune, and he saw his absence as a reasonable price to pay. Lucia tried to understand, but day by day, she felt more burdened by raising her child alone. While magazines and TV shows lauded Arthur, the multimillionaire whose success seemed boundless, an air of loneliness and estrangement reigned at home. Lucia, cradling the baby in her arms, watched the clock on the wall as it ticked on relentlessly, reminding her of how long it took her husband to return. She yearned for a family life, full of shared moments, and struggled against the feeling that she was living in a beautiful gilded cage where happiness slipped through the cracks. That evening, when Lucia turned off the main lights and sat on the couch with Jacob sleeping on her chest, she realized the gap between them was no figment of her imagination, but a reality that was slowly growing deeper. She began to wonder if there was a point of no return, or if instead, the luxury that had once dazzled her would ultimately sentence her to a loneliness more bitter than she could bear. With that unease came the understanding that the foundations of her marriage were trembling, fueling a crisis that threatened to fracture the fragile harmony of their home. On the following night, Lucia decided to prepare something special. She had noticed that in recent weeks, the emotional distance between her and Arthur had been quietly but steadily growing. So she thought of a simple yet significant gesture: an intimate dinner in the mansion's main dining room, featuring her husband's favorite dishes. The silence of the house was broken only by the soft babbles of Jacob, whom Lucia had managed to lull to sleep after a long session of gentle rocking. The table looked impeccable. Lucia had chosen a white tablecloth, crystal glasses, and scented candles whose gentle flickers danced across the porcelain plates. Next to Arthur's plate, she placed a small frame with a recent photo of Jacob, hoping to remind him that the evening was, above all, a chance to reconnect as a family. Every minute, she checked her phone. Arthur had promised to arrive by 8. Yet it was 9 o'clock when she finally heard the metallic sound of the mansion's gate opening. Arthur entered with a furrowed brow, his phone glued to his ear. Lucia approached him with a weary smile, but he held up a hand to signal for a moment of silence. Striding briskly across the living room without really looking at her, he remained focused on finishing his call. From the foyer, she caught fragments of talk about stocks, contracts, and the urgency of closing that key deal. Feeling her heart sink, Lucia waited for him to hang up, hoping he would finally remove his tie, turn off his phone, and settle in to spend some time with her. "Sorry, things got complicated at the office," he muttered when he saw her, barely lifting his eyes. "Don't worry," Lucia replied gently. "We still have dinner." They walked to the dining room. Noticing the table set, Arthur thanked her effort with a curt "thanks," aware that the main dish was already lukewarm. Lucia tried to restart the conversation, hoping to ease the tension. "I made your favorite pasta, and I left this photo of Jacob for you to see. Look at him. He can almost hold his head up all on his own." Arthur glanced quickly at the picture and nodded, but his attention seemed scattered. While Lucia served the food, he let out a weary sigh and checked his phone again, worried another urgent message might come in. Over the last few months, his company had acquired new branches, and he had to iron out details with foreign investors. For him, the pressure didn't relent, not even when he got home. "I actually wanted to talk to you," Lucia said calmly, forcing herself to stay composed. "We haven't had time to discuss Jacob's routine. The pediatrician says it's a good idea to plan short outings with him." Just then, Arthur's phone vibrated. He looked at it, annoyed, and took the call, apologizing once more to Lucia. The discomfort on his face was not necessarily aimed at her, but at the situation. Still, Lucia felt rejected, seeing how the conversation about their son fell into second place. The candles kept burning, flickering like silent witnesses to the tension in the air. A few minutes later, when he finally hung up, Arthur apologized again in a monotone voice. Trying to be understanding, Lucia took a deep breath before giving him a small smile. But that brief moment of calm was interrupted by Jacob's sudden crying upstairs. The baby had woken up upset. Maybe he sensed the discord, or maybe he was simply hungry. Lucia got up at once, leaving Arthur increasingly rattled by the notifications on his phone. When she came back with the baby in her arms, hoping at least to finish dinner together, she found Arthur standing, muttering about an email that hadn't arrived. Holding Jacob carefully, Lucia tried to show him the latest pictures of the baby on her phone, pictures in which he was laughing and stretching out his pudgy arms. Arthur glanced at them for just a second, forced a hint of approval, and then retreated back to his world of work concerns. The moment took on a heavy, uncomfortable feel. Lucia felt a slight shiver as she realized that her hopes for a romantic dinner, a chance to rebuild their lost closeness, were fading away beyond repair. She felt not so much frustration as sadness, an emotional exhaustion that left her silent as she finished her meal in resignation. After the failed dinner, Lucia waited for Arthur to head to his study, carrying his briefcase and the inevitable phone. Then she turned off the dining room lights and returned to the bedroom where little Jacob was resting after his brief fussing. She sat in a rocking chair, the baby cradled against her, and let out a sigh that dissolved into tears. Silent, stifled tears filled with guilt and melancholy. They slid down her cheeks slowly as she gazed at her son's innocent face. It pained her to think that this little boy, who needed a close father figure so much, was growing up without sharing meaningful moments with him. She wondered if, as the months went by, the distance between them would only grow wider. That fear lodged itself deep inside her, reminding her that a mother's unconditional love alone might not suffice. Jacob deserved to be raised by both of them. Still, Lucia tried to justify it to herself. She kept thinking they were going through a difficult stage, that it was normal for Arthur to be stressed because of his business responsibilities. She hoped that maybe, once the next big negotiation was over, he would take a break and dedicate time to the family. Yet the question gnawed at her relentlessly. How much longer could she endure this cycle of broken promises? With great tenderness, Lucia kissed her son's forehead, wishing her own emotional shortcomings wouldn't harm that fragile little being. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the idealized family scene. She and Arthur laughing while Jacob crawled on the carpet, children's music playing in the background. She forced herself to believe that it was still possible, that the initial cracks in their relationship could be mended before they became irreversible chasms. That night, she spent a long time looking at the crib where Jacob slept soundly. Despite all the luxury around her, a deep loneliness had taken hold of her heart. The echo of Arthur's footsteps in the hallway and the unending ping of notifications on his phone confirmed the distance now separating them. When the first glimmers of daylight appeared through the curtains, Lucia was still awake, lost in a swirl of thoughts. She felt that her marriage was teetering on the edge of an invisible cliff, her silent pleas finding no response in Arthur. She had gotten used to putting on a brave face, but that visceral fear, that loneliness might become her new normal, paralyzed her. Nevertheless, a glimmer of hope remained. Lucia didn't want to give up. Life had taught her that love could heal deep wounds if both parties were willing to try. So she resolved to try again, convinced that a heartfelt and decisive gesture on her part, followed by a real change in Arthur's attitude, might be the balm needed to restore her family life. With that determination, she gently kissed Jacob and promised herself she would keep fighting for her home. She had to find a way to get Arthur's attention, to make him see that time with his child was worth more than any million-dollar deal. For the sake of her baby, she was prepared to put aside her fears and face that uncertainty with the courage only a desperate mother could muster. Deep down, Lucia knew that the fate of their story depended largely on Arthur's response to the inevitable confrontation. With a final sigh, she closed her eyes for a moment, rocked Jacob back to sleep, and waited with a pounding heart for a new day to grant her one last chance to save her family before those first cracks turned into gaps too wide to bridge. The next day began with an uncomfortable silence in the mansion. Lucia felt on the brink of exhaustion, having spent the night holding Jacob, who was fighting off a mild cold. Arthur, for his part, had left early for an unmissable meeting with a major international partner. For days, the tension between them had been palpable. Their arguments and misunderstandings were piling up like a stack of documents no one wanted to sort through. Lucia waited patiently for him to return, seated in the large living room, trying to soothe her anxiety while Jacob slept on a blanket on the sofa. That afternoon, she had made the firm decision to confront Arthur. She needed him to be present, to be a committed father, and she couldn't bear his constant absences any longer. Her emotions were running high, but she intended to speak calmly, hoping their discussion wouldn't spiral into a barrage of accusations. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the front door finally opened. Arthur walked in, looking serious, holding a briefcase filled with documents. Without a word, he headed straight for his study to continue a pending call. Lucia, sensing her sadness turning into anger, followed him with determined steps. "Arthur, we need to talk," she said urgently, trying to steady her trembling voice. He looked up, impatient, still holding his phone to his ear. He signaled for her to wait, but Lucia refused to wait any longer. Gathering all her resolve, she snatched the phone from him and set it down on the desk, cutting the call without hesitation. Arthur's eyes widened with disbelief and fury, aware that the deal at stake was critically important to the company. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice low. "I'm tired of business being your everything," Lucia replied, trying to sound firm. "Your son and I are not some inconvenience you can keep putting off. I need you here. Jacob needs you." A dense silence filled the study, clashing with Arthur's turbulent thoughts. On the one hand, he knew Lucia was right. On the other, he felt cornered by the pressure of a crucial business negotiation, one that could determine the future of his foreign investments. Despite it all, he refused to admit it at that moment. "I don't have time for pointless arguments," he said, raising his voice. "Don't you understand? I'm about to close a deal that will secure our future. Couldn't you at least wait until I'm done before demanding explanations?" Lucia felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't back down. She remembered the countless times she had kept quiet. Physical and emotional exhaustion pushed her onward, even though she was blinking back tears. "It's been many days, Arthur. Weeks, in fact, where you barely see Jacob. And when you finally come home, you lock yourself away with your calls and don't listen to a single word I say. I asked you to help me with the baby this morning, but again, your schedule came first." Lucia's words sparked a mix of guilt and anger in Arthur. The build-up of stress over the project and the fear of losing his partner's attention triggered an overblown reaction. He slammed his hand on the desk, making a few papers jump and causing Lucia to step back in alarm. "Enough!" he shouted, enraged. "I'm sick of you distracting me at the worst possible time. This child..." he added impatiently, gesturing at the portable crib where Jacob usually lay, has only caused problems for me. Don't you see that every one of your dramas comes just when I'm about to finalize something important? I can't be tending to every cry or every diaper change when the whole world depends on me. Lucia froze, feeling the air in the study turn stifling. She had never heard Arthur talk like that about his own son. The love she once thought she saw in his eyes seemed eclipsed by a surge of uncontrollable anger. Before she could respond, Arthur took a threatening step toward the door, making it clear he didn't want to hear any more demands. Don't you see, I need peace to work, he went on, his voice thick with resentment. If you can't support me right now, just get out. I have no patience for more useless complaints. His words struck Lucia with cruel force. Up until that moment, she had thought this was just another argument, maybe the worst so far, but she never expected Arthur to go so far as to throw her out. In a flash, she felt disbelief and terror. Would he really follow through on that threat? Arthur, eyes blazing and heart pounding, refused to back down. He felt how intense his anger was, but he also felt justified by the pressure he was under. Are you throwing me out? Lucia stammered. Yes, go. Take the baby and don't come back until you understand that I can't handle everything by myself. The decision was made. With fury coursing through his veins, Arthur didn't weigh the consequences of his words. Lucia, tears streaming down her cheeks, knew that staying meant enduring an irreversible humiliation. Feeling too weak for another confrontation, she left the study, grabbed a small suitcase, and packed the essentials for Jacob: diapers, a few changes of clothes, formula, and bottles. As she gathered her things, Lucia paused for a moment to take in what she was leaving behind. The large bedrooms, the bright hallways, the panoramic view from the windows, all those luxuries blurred in her mind. Despair clouded her judgment, and her heart pounded painfully, spurring her to leave. She took Jacob in her arms, feeling her legs trembling beneath her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Arthur in the foyer, his face contorted with anger, as though about to fling another insult. However, he simply stood there in silence, clenching his fists in barely contained fury. When Lucia opened the mansion's grand door, a cold wind pricked at her skin. Her eyes brimming with tears, she descended the steps and crossed the garden toward the main gate. Under different circumstances, that walk might have been a display of luxury. Now it felt like the bitterest journey of her life. Each step confirmed the chasm that had just opened between her and the man she had chosen to build a family with. Upon reaching the street, she paused for a moment, still holding Jacob tightly. He slept on, oblivious to his mother's emotional storm. Lucia took one last look at the mansion where she had once dreamed of creating a warm home. Now she saw only an imposing structure, cold as Arthur's heart at that instant. With a lump in her throat, Lucia got into the taxi that whisked her away from that place. Her body shook, and one question repeated over and over in her mind. Will Arthur come to his senses? She felt fear and uncertainty, but also a strange sense of relief at having escaped the toxic atmosphere that had settled in the house. As the taxi pulled away, Lucia, unable to hold back her tears, kissed Jacob's forehead. While the streets blurred before her teary eyes, she vowed that no matter what happened, she would fight for her child with all her might. In the mansion, Arthur remained standing in the foyer, gazing out the window. Though anger still pulsed within him, something akin to a shiver of remorse began to grow, faint and late. Ever since leaving the mansion, Lucia had felt adrift. She was temporarily staying at the home of an old college friend, Helena, who lived in a small apartment in a middle-class neighborhood. Despite the discomfort of not having her own space, Lucia was grateful for the safe roof and the warm welcome Helena offered her without hesitation. She didn't want to share all the details of her argument with Arthur, but the reality was plain in her downcast face and the sadness that clung to her every step. Jacob adapted relatively well to his new environment. Though he cried at night, seeking his mother's warmth, he seemed calm during the day. Lucia felt relieved that, despite everything, her son retained his usual gentle demeanor. Even so, she knew their financial situation would soon grow complicated. Until now, she had relied on Arthur's support for medical expenses and other necessities. Without his help, she would have to figure out how to pay for the pediatrician and daily living costs on her own. Lucia's savings were limited. During her marriage, she had left her job to devote herself entirely to Jacob, trusting the stability of Arthur's business. However, with the current urgency, she reached out to a former co-worker to see if she could land a temporary position. In the meantime, she would cover the basics with the little money left in her bank account. Though she felt fragile, Lucia knew she needed to schedule a pediatric checkup for Jacob. After his mild cold, he needed a routine exam to rule out any complications and make sure he was developing well. So she called the clinic where he was usually treated and made an appointment for the following week. The nights dragged on. Lucia slept very little, spending hours staring at the ceiling of the small room she shared with Jacob, wondering if Arthur would try to reach her. She checked her phone anxiously, but received no calls or messages from him. At times, she convinced herself that perhaps it was better this way. Another argument could only worsen her emotional state. Yet deep down, she wished he would reconsider, own up to his mistake, and ask them to come back. Meanwhile, Helena tried to ease the tension. In the mornings, she would brew coffee and offer Lucia words of encouragement, reminding her that Jacob's well-being was the priority. Still, nagging doubts plagued her. How will I manage if Arthur refuses to help financially? Should I take legal action for child support? With each passing day, the weight of those questions grew heavier. Finally, the day of the pediatric checkup arrived. Lucia woke up early, got Jacob ready, and checked her bag twice to be sure she had everything: diapers, wipes, his medical booklet, and enough money for the visit. Helena gave her a warm hug and wished her luck, reminding her to take care on the road. Lucia had borrowed an old car from one of Helena's neighbors, who had initially offered to drive them to the clinic but, at the last minute, had to take care of a work commitment. He left them the car instead. Though she felt uneasy about driving a vehicle she wasn't familiar with, she had no other choice if she didn't want to miss the baby's appointment. The route to the clinic took them through several busy streets. Driving at a moderate speed, Lucia kept a watchful eye on traffic while Jacob dozed in his car seat. She was grateful for that small reprieve. But only a few kilometers from their destination, as she rounded a slightly steep curve in the road, the car began to shake. Lucia felt a sudden jolt in the steering wheel and heard a metallic screech that made her heart jump. Alarmed, she tried to brake, but the pedals felt off. Her heart pounded wildly as she realized she was losing control of the vehicle. It veered toward the left, where a retaining wall separated the road from a steep drop. An icy terror seized Lucia, who had no time to react. A thunderous crash shattered the air as the car slammed against the wall and bounced off. The impact was brutal, ripping metal and glass in every direction. The front of the vehicle crumpled violently, trapping Lucia, who could only manage a strangled cry. Everything jolted at once. Time seemed to freeze in an endless second before coming to a terrifying halt. Lucia's death was instantaneous. The crash had hit her with such force that she felt no pain. Jacob, however, was critically injured. Though his car seat absorbed some of the impact, the side collision was strong enough to cause severe injuries. The baby's frantic cries, mingling with the smell of fuel and the grinding of wreckage, shook the few onlookers who rushed over after hearing the crash. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Arthur was in a high-stakes business meeting, surrounded by executives in impeccable suits and grave expressions. The atmosphere in the room was tense, yet he maintained his usual composure, discussing figures and financial data with apparent poise. His focus was suddenly broken when one of his assistants entered, visibly upset, asking to speak to him in private. Feeling uneasy, Arthur stood and excused himself from the meeting. Out in the hallway, the assistant informed him that the hospital had called to report a serious accident. They mentioned Lucia's name and a wounded baby. Arthur felt his world collapse at his feet. For several moments, he stood speechless, unable to grasp the gravity of what he was hearing. His hands began to sweat, and his voice trembled as he asked for more details. Stammering, the assistant relayed what little he knew. A fatal crash, Lucia killed on impact, and Jacob, in critical condition, rushed to surgery. The word "killed" echoed like a grim refrain in Arthur's mind. The air seemed to vanish from his lungs, and the folder he was holding slipped from his hands, scattering papers down the hallway. His disbelief and panic showed plainly on his face. Unable to form coherent words, Arthur nearly ran out of the building, his mind awash in guilt and terror. The $1 million deal no longer mattered. All he could think was that Lucia was gone forever, taken by a brutal accident. Suddenly, he realized that the fury and pride that had blinded him might well have led him to the most devastating loss of his life. Arthur arrived at the hospital with his pulse racing and his thoughts in turmoil. He couldn't recall how he had driven there or how much time had passed since he'd left the meeting. Images of the crash blurred in his mind, jostling with the assistant's stricken expression and the echo of the word "killed" pounding in his head. Every step toward the emergency room brought him closer to an unbearable truth. As soon as he reached the information desk, a somber-faced doctor approached him. Without much preamble, the doctor explained they had done everything possible for Lucia, but there was no way to revive her after the brutal crash. Arthur felt the air become suddenly unbreathable. For a few moments he stood there in silence, watching the corridor seem to close in around him. He wanted to say something, her name, a cry that this was all a mistake, but only a strangled sound emerged. "Lucia." "Where is she?" he murmured, his voice shaking. The doctor looked at him sympathetically before pointing to a door at the end of the hall, warning him that what lay beyond would be a harsh blow. As Arthur walked toward it, the doctor continued explaining Jacob's condition. The paramedics had managed to rescue him alive, but his injuries were severe. Among them was irreparable damage to his lower limb, forcing the surgeons to make an extreme decision: amputate his foot to save his life. Arthur felt another crushing weight slam into his chest. First Lucia's death, and now the news that his son bore the indelible mark of a tragedy for which he was indirectly responsible. For an instant, he wanted to cling to the notion that this was all a nightmare from which he would soon awaken. Yet reality pressed in with merciless force. Lucia was gone, and Jacob faced a difficult future, forced to live with a disability from infancy. Overcome by a grief that didn't fit his image as a powerful man, Arthur opened the door to the small room where his wife's body lay. A cloth covered her face. With trembling hands, he pulled it back, and there was Lucia, pale, unmoving. In that moment, a sharp, piercing pain flooded his chest, as if his heart were collapsing under a crushing weight. He recalled the last time he saw her walking out of the mansion, carrying a suitcase and the baby, after he had driven her away in an act of rage and pride. He then realized that his fury had been the spark that set this catastrophe in motion. Without his explosive anger, Lucia would never have been driving a borrowed car that day, nor would she have needed to seek shelter at a friend's house. His mind whirled, tormenting him with images of the immediate past, the arguments, the ruined dinner, Lucia's tears at being ignored, and above all the exact moment he shouted, "Get out of my house!" In that sterile room, only the distant ticking of a clock and Arthur's ragged breathing broke the silence. Tears started streaming from his eyes, coursing down his cheeks unchecked. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried in such despair. He knew that no money, no business deal, no amount of influence would ever bring Lucia back. A wave of self-disgust rolled over him as he realized that, through his emotional neglect, he had doomed his own family. When the doctor urged him to visit Jacob in the pediatric intensive care unit, Arthur gathered just enough strength to leave the room where Lucia lay. He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye at that moment. He walked in silence through the white corridors until he reached the section where his son was being treated. There, behind a pane of glass, he saw Jacob hooked up to monitors and surrounded by machines tracking his vital signs. With a bandage covering the place where his foot had once been, the little boy stirred gently, as if calling for his mother. Arthur rested his forehead against the glass, feeling as though his soul were shattering. Guilt ate away at him, and the realization that he would never forgive himself for thrusting them into this situation gripped his mind with crushing force. Lucia's funeral was arranged hastily, as her family wished to bring her back to the place where she had grown up. They held the ceremony in a modest cemetery, far from the lavish grounds Arthur could have easily afforded. However, Lucia's family preferred a more intimate setting for their final farewell. When Arthur arrived at the wake, the atmosphere grew tense. Several of Lucia's relatives gave him looks of deep resentment, aware, at least in broad strokes, that she had left her home following an insurmountable argument. Though no one knew all the details, there was no doubt that their rift had played a part in this tragedy. One of Lucia's aunts burst into tears the moment she saw him, sobbing uncontrollably and blaming him for their suffering. A cousin, his face red with anger, approached as if ready to confront Arthur, but other family members intervened before the situation escalated. Arthur remained silent. He accepted their accusations because, in his heart, he believed they were justified. Yet he experienced a painful inner catharsis that left him paralyzed. As expected, the media picked up the story. Headlines tarnished Arthur's business reputation, highlighting the millionaire's coldness in the face of his family's misfortune. Some reporters pointed to his past philanthropic activities, drawing ironic contrasts with his apparent disregard for his own wife's needs. Rumors and speculation went viral on social media about how Lucia had ended up living away from her luxurious home in the days leading up to the accident. The media pressure became unbearable. On every TV program, his name was bandied about, his humanity questioned, and social networks were ablaze with ruthless condemnation. Overwhelmed by the criticism, he shut himself away in his mansion, consumed by remorse that kept him awake at night. The once pristine walls and silent hallways, formerly symbols of his material success, became relentless reminders of his personal failure. In the main living room, filled with contemporary art, he paced nervously, haunted by the final memories he had of Lucia. He imagined her leaving in tears, silently begging him to change before it was too late. Now it was painfully clear that change had come too late, or worse yet, never arrived at all. On the few occasions Arthur ventured outside, paparazzi hounded him relentlessly. He tried to hide behind dark glasses, but the camera flashes followed him like an unescapable public judgment. Once, after shoving a photographer aside, he rushed back to the mansion and instructed his security team to tighten measures to keep the press away. Meanwhile, Jacob remained hospitalized, watched over by medical staff who did everything in their power to stabilize him and prepare him for the grueling rehabilitation that lay ahead. Eaten up by guilt, Arthur delayed visiting his son. He felt unworthy of looking him in the eye, terrified of facing the little boy who had lost his mother, and part of his foot, due to Arthur's irresponsibility. But amid his sleepless nights, Arthur realized that putting off the inevitable only prolonged his cowardice. Lucia deserved for him to devote himself to their child, at least to partially atone for the harm he had caused. With that thought, he took his first step. He called the hospital to check on Jacob and resolved to assume responsibility for his son. Still trapped in a spiral of grief, carrying the memory of Lucia's casket as a painful testament to what he had lost, Arthur began to see that redemption could only come through his son. At that moment, however, all he felt was a yawning gulf of guilt, a certainty that each selfish decision had led to the tragedy now devouring him. Arthur showed up at the hospital the following day with unsteady steps. After several days holed up in his mansion, ravaged by remorse and grief, he knew he could no longer avoid seeing his son. The tension in his face betrayed the turmoil within. On one hand, he dreaded confronting Jacob's innocent gaze, knowing the irreparable harm he'd caused. On the other, a sense of responsibility stirred inside him, reminding him that his child still needed him. Arriving at the intensive rehabilitation unit, he was met by a doctor whose expression was serious yet kind. The doctor explained that the emergency surgery to amputate the baby's foot had saved his life, though he had lost a great deal of blood and still required specialized care. Jacob was under constant observation, hooked up to monitors tracking his blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen levels. The medical team monitored his progress and administered pain relievers to ease any discomfort. The smell of disinfectant and the steady beeping of medical devices put Arthur on high emotional alert. Accustomed to boardrooms and luxurious offices, he felt out of place in the hushed corridor where machines beeped at intervals. Crossing into Jacob's cubicle, his heart pounded at the sight of the tiny figure lying in a hospital crib, tubes and wires everywhere. Sensing Arthur's stiffness, the doctor invited him to sit on a small bench beside the crib. In a calm, measured voice, he explained the care Jacob would require. The amputation site had to be watched closely for signs of infection, and a lengthy rehabilitation process lay ahead for the baby to adapt to this new condition. Over time, he would need specialized prosthetics, regular checkups, and physical therapy. Arthur felt overwhelmed by all the information. Inwardly, he pictured hiring an entire staff, full-time nurses, nannies to oversee hygiene and care, renowned physical therapists who would come to his mansion every day. His first instinct was to throw money at the problem, as he'd done countless times before. Doing so would allow him to keep his distance and avoid the crushing guilt that tormented him. But as he stood and moved closer to the crib, he saw Jacob squirm and let out a faint whimper. A nearby monitor registered a slight increase in the baby's heart rate, a sign of distress or possibly fear at sensing an unfamiliar presence. Arthur felt a surge of emotion when his eyes fell on the bandage covering the lower part of Jacob's leg. The child looked so vulnerable and fragile, surrounded by IV bags and cables. After a brief hesitation, Arthur reached out and gently touched the tiny hand. Jacob let out a small, hesitant sound, somewhere between crying and curiosity, his eyes barely opening. That fleeting connection rocked Arthur in a way he had never experienced. For the first time, he felt a protective instinct so powerful that it overshadowed his fear and guilt. This baby was still his son, a being wholly dependent on him now that Lucia was gone. Noticing Arthur's inner struggle, the doctor continued explaining the child's recovery process. He remarked that if certain conditions for cleanliness and proper monitoring equipment were met, Jacob could be discharged soon. Though his explanation was technical and thorough, it also carried a note of hope. The boy could look forward to a future if he received adequate care. Just then, Jacob began crying, flailing his arms ineffectively. The sound tore through Arthur's chest. He stepped forward cautiously, every movement feeling like a leap into the unknown. Placing a trembling hand on the edge of the crib, he leaned in and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here, son," he managed to say, his own voice breaking. The reaction was instantaneous. Hearing a gentle, nearby voice, Jacob quieted somewhat, as though reassured by a human presence. For Arthur, it was a revelation. He understood that he could no longer hide behind his money or the pride that once defined him. His child needed a father who was truly there for him, not a mere checkbook for medical bills. In that moment, he felt a new resolve. Despite knowing next to nothing about raising a child, he couldn't shrug off his responsibility or pawn it off on others. He owed at least that much to Jacob, and to Lucia's memory. With tearful eyes, Arthur spoke softly with the doctor, expressing his desire to bring Jacob home as soon as it was safe and learn how to care for him with professional guidance. The doctor nodded, voicing approval. Of course, it would be ideal to have nurses available for the first few weeks, he said, but he emphasized that a loving, consistent family presence could never be replaced. Over the following days, Arthur visited the hospital every morning. He watched the nurses carefully, mentally noting how to hold Jacob properly, how to keep the wound clean, which simple exercises might help in the baby's early rehabilitation. Though he had hired a specialized therapist for when the child came home, he realized nothing could replace hands-on parental care, something he had never truly provided. Finally, the day arrived when doctors cleared Jacob to be discharged. Arthur signed the paperwork, his heart racing, and walked into the critical care unit to collect his son. He recognized that this was far more than a logistical task. It was a pivotal turning point in his life. As he placed the baby into a specially designed car seat, he felt both uneasy and hopeful. Now more stable, Jacob let out a small whine as if protesting the change of surroundings. Arthur cradled him, striving to convey a sense of safety. He vowed then and there to do whatever it took to become the father Lucia had always wanted him to be. He still had no idea how to handle such immense responsibility, but he was determined to learn, driven by the conviction that his son deserved more than a mere financial inheritance. He deserved the unconditional presence of his father. Thus, carrying Jacob in his arms, Arthur left the hospital and entered a new chapter of his life. He left behind the cold hallways and constant beeping of machines for a reality he had never truly faced before, that of a man stepping into fatherhood for the first time. And though uncertainty loomed large, he sensed a flicker of hope shining in his child's eyes. Arthur carried Jacob into the mansion with a lump in his throat. In recent weeks, that place had come to symbolize his guilt and loneliness. Now, however, he saw it as the necessary refuge for his son. The imposing, distant front entrance suddenly felt almost threatening. The moment he stepped through the door, he was hit by a cold wave of realization. He would have to confront not only the memories contained within those walls, but also the enormous challenges of becoming a full-time father. The first few days were a whirlwind of emotions and learning experiences. Arthur, so used to meticulously scheduled meetings, found himself jolted awake in the middle of the night to calm Jacob's cries. Diapers, bottles, and baby babbling disrupted his routine at every turn. More than once, faced with the smell of a dirty diaper, he frowned in confusion before accepting that this was now part of his life. The mansion's pristine white walls took on an entirely new feel. Toys lay scattered across the living room, baby wipes were stashed in the kitchen, and small hats were ready to protect Jacob's leg wound. The scene was a far cry from the immaculate setting once used for business dinners. On the third day at home, the child therapist he had hired on the doctor's advice arrived. Her name was Rachel, and in a warm yet professional manner, she showed Arthur various early stimulation exercises. She taught him how to hold Jacob properly to help strengthen his muscles, how to gently massage the area affected by the amputation, and which sounds or toys would best encourage his development. In the past, Arthur would have delegated these tasks to nannies or nurses. But now, he listened nervously yet sincerely, recognizing it was the only way to truly connect with his baby without putting up emotional barriers. Rachel spoke about the importance of physical contact, of human warmth, to foster the baby's sense of security and trust. Arthur did his best to mimic every movement. He learned how to softly hold Jacob's limbs and place him on a small activity mat. He also understood that although the child would need specialized care for a future prosthesis, his most vital need right now was a sense of love and safety. Feeling the faint smile that Jacob managed between his little sounds became Arthur's daily motivation to overcome his fears. Even as Arthur immersed himself in his new role, business pressures kept mounting. For years, he had been the unquestioned center of his companies, a leader on whom his partners relied to make major decisions. His extended absence began to worry the top executives. The recent merger with an international group demanded Arthur's oversight for ongoing meetings and investment reports that couldn't be delayed. Some partners called him repeatedly, expecting immediate answers that he seldom provided. In the mansion, the phone rang incessantly. Sometimes Arthur let the calls go to voicemail, Other times, he would pick up briefly, trying to end the conversation as soon as possible so he could return to Jacob's care. The strain showed in the emails flooding his inbox. "We need your approval for the new project. The investors are pushing for an in-person meeting. The company's reputation is at stake." Each notification reignited his internal struggle between the old drive for success and the new responsibility he had assumed as a father. One particular afternoon brought matters to a head. Rachel was teaching him balance exercises for Jacob when his phone started buzzing insistently. It was the manager of one of his subsidiaries, demanding he join an urgent video conference. Arthur's pulse quickened, torn between the child who depended on him and the obligations that had always come first in his life. Before, he wouldn't have hesitated. He would have joined the call immediately. This time, however, he froze, looking down at Jacob's face as the baby smiled at the sound of Rachel's voice. When he finally answered, his associates were furious, reminding him of the danger of losing million-dollar contracts if he didn't take charge right away. In the past, the proud, power-hungry Arthur would have silenced everyone and taken firm control. But this changed version of himself felt something else, an overwhelming weariness of that frenetic pace, and the realization that money and prestige meant nothing if it meant sacrificing his son's well-being. That night, as he fed Jacob from a bottle, Arthur pondered his colleagues' complaints. He felt strangely relieved to prioritize his son over business affairs, as though he were honoring a moral debt to Lucia and to himself. Of course, he knew he had to strike a balance. Financial security was essential to cover Jacob's long-term needs, but he was increasingly convinced that his loving presence was indispensable. He could no longer be the distant man who lived just to sign contracts. In the days that followed, the change in him became evident. He began new routines, waking up before dawn to review documents, answer urgent emails, and give clear instructions to his managers. Then, when Jacob opened his eyes, Arthur would close his laptop and devote himself entirely to being a father. This precarious balance caused friction with some partners who questioned his commitment, but it also stirred admiration among certain employees who never suspected the feared magnate had such a human side. By the end of that intense week, Arthur sat in Jacob's room, watching the baby sleep in his crib. The sleepless nights, the endless diapers, and the constant worry about his amputated leg had drained him, yet they had also brought him closer to his son in ways he never thought possible. Resting a hand on the edge of the crib, he realized he was finally starting to grow into fatherhood. That understanding, mixed with the ever-present longing for Lucia, spurred him on. He was determined to face the challenges ahead, both in business and, above all, in raising Jacob. Arthur was holding Jacob when the mansion's doorbell rang. The baby, now babbling more often, reacted to his father's voice with curious glances and fleeting smiles. Although their days were filled with therapy, exercises, and constant care, the atmosphere in the house felt less oppressive than before. Each small step of progress fueled hope for a more stable future. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the serious face of Isabel, Lucia's mother, who looked him up and down with open distrust. Beside her stood Lucia's older sister, her eyes reflecting deep resentment. They were carrying a small suitcase and wore expressions that made it clear this was far from a friendly visit. "We've come to collect some of Lucia's things," Isabel announced bluntly. "Her clothes, her photo albums, whatever she left here." A knot tightened in Arthur's chest. Lucia was gone, and her family's arrival to pick up her belongings was a harsh reminder of how final her absence was. Still, he understood that it was an inevitable step. He asked them inside, leading them through the house, unwilling to part from Jacob, cradled against his chest, even for a moment longer than necessary. They walked in silence until they reached the room Arthur had once shared with Lucia. The walls remained painted in soft hues, and on the nightstand stood the same wedding photo in its frame, a picture Arthur hadn't had the courage to move. Upon seeing it, Lucia's sister's face filled with pain, which quickly morphed into anger. "This wouldn't have happened if you had treated her right," she said, her trembling voice choked with emotion. "Lucia wouldn't be dead if you hadn't kicked her out of the house." Her accusation fell like a hammer. Arthur could feel both women's seething gazes and realized each passing second served as a silent trial. He carefully held Jacob tighter, fearing the baby would sense the tension and start to cry. "I know," he replied quietly, guilt weighing heavily on his every word. "I know all of this happened because of me." The two women exchanged glances, surprised by how openly he was accepting blame. Before either could respond, he went on, "I'll never be able to bring Lucia back or forgive myself for what I did. But I want you to know I'm going to take care of Jacob. I realize that won't undo the damage, but—" His voice caught in his throat. "I promise I'll devote myself to him completely." A heavy silence fell over the room. Surprisingly calm, the baby was fiddling with the collar of his father's shirt, unaware of the tension emanating from the adults. Isabel took a deep breath. Though her expression stayed severe, something in her eyes seemed to soften. "She loved you, despite everything," she whispered. "She always believed that, in time, you'd learn how to be a real father." Hearing those words, Arthur closed his eyes in grief. For a moment, he pictured Lucia's smiling face, imagining how life might have been if he had put his family first from the start. He was overcome by a mix of regret and boundless tenderness for Jacob. "I've made mistakes I can never fix," he admitted, "but I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Jacob grows up surrounded by love." Lucia's sister nodded slowly, her bitterness still apparent, yet she seemed willing to listen. Together they began sorting through Lucia's clothes, drawers filled with notebooks and papers, and a small dresser containing the modest jewelry she had cherished. Every item bore silent witness to a life cut short under tragic circumstances. When they finished, Isabel lifted the suitcase holding Lucia's belongings and cast a final look around the room, as though bidding her daughter farewell once and for all. Then, before leaving, she approached Jacob carefully. The baby offered her one of his tentative smiles, and Lucia's mother couldn't resist gently stroking his head. "Take good care of him," she said firmly, meeting Arthur's gaze. "He's all we have left of Lucia." Arthur vowed that he would. In that pivotal moment, though it wasn't an instant reconciliation, a bridge of understanding emerged. Lucia's family was still hurt and resentful, yet they could see his genuine remorse and recognize his real commitment to Jacob's well-being. The weeks that followed were marked by Jacob's notable progress in his therapy sessions. Under the guidance of Rachel, his child therapist, and a specialized medical team, the baby began strengthening his body despite the amputation. His daily exercises involved small movements of his limbs, balance-focused stimuli, and gentle massages to help him adapt to his new reality. Each time Jacob managed to lift his little arms or hold himself a bit more upright, Arthur felt such intense pride that it seemed like a priceless gift. He watched the baby's smile becoming more frequent, how he would respond to Arthur's voice with a special sparkle in his eyes. What had once been a non-existent father-son relationship was now deepening into a bond that moved him in unexpected ways. Doctors explained that given Jacob's young age, his future adaptation to a prosthesis had a strong likelihood of success. The child, growing up with the prosthesis, would integrate it more naturally and, with proper therapy, could enjoy a very active life. Arthur mentally noted every recommendation, from different types of prosthetics to early stimulation exercises. Nothing felt too daunting if it meant giving his son a chance at a full life. Lucia's family, though still keeping some distance, began showing slight signs of openness. Isabel called a couple of times to check on the baby's health. Though her tone conveyed lingering distrust, she was reassured knowing that Arthur was personally involved in caring for Jacob. Lucia's sister, less willing to talk, nevertheless agreed to visit the baby from time to time. During each visit, the mansion felt less hostile than before. The presence of toys and baby items gave it a warmth starkly different from its former austerity. Arthur welcomed these visits with humility, aware that it would take time to erase the image of the furious man who once drove his family away. He knew forgiveness was a long process and had no illusions about a sudden reconciliation. Still, each small milestone Jacob reached, every gesture Lucia's family made to spend time with him, felt like a door cracking open, a tentative path toward rebuilding their ties. In the midst of this fragile climate, Arthur experienced for the first time a love for his son that eclipsed any business deal or contract. His old obsession with corporate success had given way to a powerful, unbreakable feeling, the duty to be a good father. Even though shadows from the past still loomed over him, he seemed finally to have found a purpose beyond money and prestige. During this interlude of waiting and hope, Jacob kept growing. His babbling started to shift into more coherent sounds, and his eyes widened with curiosity as he discovered every corner of the house. Unbeknownst to him, the child was becoming the link between Arthur and Lucia's family, a bridge that held out the possibility that, through love and devotion, they could shape a different future, one in which Lucia's tragic death would not be the final chapter of their lives, but rather the start of a story of redemption. Arthur spent several sleepless nights torn between urgent business demands and the newfound awareness he had cultivated since caring for Jacob. His life had always revolved around business, closing contracts, expanding markets, partnering with industry giants. All of that had earned him a formidable reputation and massive wealth, yet it had also cut him off from what truly mattered. Now, whenever he tried to review financial reports or follow up on his latest merger, Jacob's face flashed in his mind, his budding smile, the brightness in his eyes, and his unflagging curiosity about the world around him. The company Arthur led had taken a hit during his extended absence. His partners and investors demanded that he return to the helm with the same intensity he once had. They needed to restore market confidence, finalize pending deals, and launch the expansions awaiting his approval to operate overseas. Yet whenever Arthur joined a video conference or answered an urgent call, a knot twisted in his stomach. Something within him had changed irreversibly. He could no longer lose himself in the corporate whirlwind without considering the human cost of his actions. In the meetings he did manage to attend, he noticed some board members eyeing him with disbelief. They couldn't understand his sudden shift in priorities. He had once been relentless, never hesitating to sacrifice weekends or holidays if it meant signing a lucrative deal. Now, though, he arrived late to meetings, cancelled commitments at the last minute, and avoided business trips so he wouldn't leave Jacob alone. As a result, discontent grew among his partners, and several threatened to pull their investments if Arthur didn't revert to his former ways. That tension followed him for days, forcing him to examine what kind of life he truly wanted. Part of him recognized that the business was crucial for financing Jacob's special care and guaranteeing him a decent future. But the other part refused to let work remain the central pillar of his existence. Though he berated himself for every past decision, he was beginning to feel that devoting himself to Jacob was the only path toward atoning for the guilt that haunted him since Lucia's tragedy. Weighed down by these pressures, and aware that he needed to restore some order, Arthur made a definitive choice. He summoned his most influential partners to an extraordinary meeting and announced that, in a few days, he would hold a press conference. Initially, the executives felt relieved, imagining that the magnate had come to his senses and would reclaim his corporate throne with renewed vigor. What none of them suspected was that Arthur had a much more surprising, transformative move in mind. The morning of the press conference arrived amid a charged atmosphere of anticipation. The event took place in one of the city's most exclusive hotels, a venue Arthur had used for special occasions. There was a stage, a lectern, and rows of seating for the press and the company's top partners. Television cameras were lined up at the back, their flashes already flickering as the assembled crowd waited impatiently. Arthur entered with a confident stride, though his expression showed a quiet determination, different from the lofty arrogance of his past self. He wore a dark suit without any showy flourishes and a single gold pin on his lapel, an understated reminder of his position in the firm. After acknowledging the attendees with a slight nod, he walked up to the podium and glanced at the microphone. A ripple of chatter swept through the audience as he took a breath to begin. "Thank you for coming," he said in a somber tone. "I know many of you are here to hear updates on the company's direction, new investments, and expansion plans we've postponed. However, before discussing any business matters, I want to share something personal, something that has changed my life in an irreversible way." A hush fell over the room, the crowd taken aback by the personal touch in his words. Arthur went on, steadying the slight tremble in his voice. "Recently, I experienced a family tragedy that forced me to re-examine everything. My wife, Lucia, died in a car accident. An accident," he paused, fighting to keep his voice from cracking. "An accident that took place shortly after an argument in which I threw her out of our home. I accept full moral responsibility for that, because my arrogance and blind devotion to business drove an irreparable wedge into our marriage." Some reporters, who only had sketchy details of the story, began scribbling furiously. Others, moved by the magnate's candor, watched him intently. Arthur drew in another breath and continued. "My son, Jacob, survived the crash, but lost his foot. He now needs ongoing care and therapy. For years, I believed that success and wealth were all I needed to feel fulfilled. I neglected my family and became a distant, arrogant man, fixated on power. Today, I regret that deeply." He lowered his gaze for a moment, and his voice grew softer. "I've called this press conference to make a public apology, not just to my wife's family, who bears the irreversible loss of Lucia, but also to the employees, partners, and collaborators who once felt the impact of my selfish behavior. I beg forgiveness for my actions and inactions. I realize many may not be able to grant it, but I must at least express my remorse." The auditorium went silent, as though time had paused. After a few long, tense seconds, Arthur dropped his next bombshell. "I have decided to redirect part of my efforts and resources toward creating a foundation for children with physical disabilities. This foundation will bear Lucia's name and will focus on providing therapies, prosthetics, and financial support to families who, like mine, face unexpected adversities. My own company, the one you all know, will be one of the main pillars of this initiative." A murmur of astonishment swept through the room. Even the most skeptical partners exchanged looks, unsure how to react. The magnate who had always preached maximizing profits was now announcing a charitable project motivated by personal tragedy. Arthur concluded with words laden with sincerity. "I'm doing this in memory of my wife and for my son's future. I've realized the only way to honor her and atone for my guilt is to help other children avoid being limited by a disability. I want to use my resources and contacts to make a small difference in a world I ignored for so long from within my bubble of privilege." After his final statements, the applause began timidly, then grew into a thunderous ovation. Some journalists stood, others hurried to fire off questions. Arthur, his heart still pounding, felt that for once he was setting aside his pride to do something truly meaningful. He scanned the room for his partners and caught glimpses of both confusion and cautious approval. He knew he'd face criticism and suspicion, but also that he had taken the step his conscience had demanded for some time. In that moment, more than a powerful millionaire, Arthur felt like a relieved man. At last, he had spoken the truth, asked for forgiveness, and announced a new purpose giving meaning to his life, fighting for Jacob's well-being and that of all children who, like him, would have to overcome physical and emotional obstacles. The public confession could not erase his past, but it opened the door to a future where love and family responsibility would finally take the center stage they had always deserved. Following that poignant public confession, Arthur experienced a continual duality in his surroundings. On one hand, there was applause and admiration for the millionaire who had bravely acknowledged his mistakes and shared his family tragedy to launch a humanitarian project. On the other, critical voices denounced his actions as a mere tactic to repair his image after the media scandal. The press was divided. Some headlines described his speech as a significant step toward empathy, while others accused him of pulling strings for his own convenience. In the corporate realm, his more pragmatic partners did not hide a certain unease. Arthur's company was robust and profitable, but its new focus on social initiatives triggered doubts about future earnings. Even so, most adapted cautiously, recognizing that Arthur's renewed public image could prove beneficial in attracting investors who cared not just about profit margins, but also about corporate responsibility. For his part, Arthur led a life far different than before. He resumed some business responsibilities to ensure financial stability, careful not to fall back into an obsession with numbers. He delegated more tasks to a trusted team of younger executives with fresh perspectives. Now, he devoted much of his time to overseeing the Foundation for Children with Physical Disabilities, just as he had announced. The mansion, once resembling a modern museum, now felt like a genuine home for Jacob. To the surprise of some employees, the place was no longer immaculate. Toys, blankets, and small cushions lay scattered around the living room. Arthur had converted one of the rooms into a space for play and early stimulation. There, Rachel, the child therapist, came several times a week to work with Jacob, organize exercises, and monitor his progress. In day-to-day life, it became commonplace to see Arthur carrying Jacob through the halls, gently babbling to him or telling him stories in a tender voice. Expensive ties and a distant demeanor now took a back seat. His priority was holding his son close, looking after him, and being there for every step of his rehabilitation. As Jacob grew, doctors and therapists prepared a small prosthetic for his amputated leg. Although it was an early, quite basic model, it would help the baby get used to the weight and feel of having that extra component attached to his body. When Arthur heard about these developments, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Before, he might have approached it with a problem-solving mindset. Now he saw it as a chance to watch his son persevere, taking symbolic steps toward independence. With each session, Jacob's smile grew brighter. He learned to sit more steadily and to crawl in his own particular way, compensating for his limitations. Rachel and the medical team praised the child's resilience and cheerfulness, convinced that his young age and Arthur's unwavering support were key to a better prognosis. Lucia's family still grieved deeply for their loss, but gradually they became more open. Lucia's mother and even her sister visited the mansion from time to see Jacob, bringing him clothes or special toys. Although conversations with Arthur remained tense, especially at first, the baby's progress and his evident devotion to caring for him began to soften some of their resentment. On one of those visits, Lucia's mother held Jacob in her arms and grew emotional as he wrapped his tiny hand around hers. Watching them, Arthur stood off to the side, feeling a slight tremor in his shoulders at the memory of Lucia. His mother-in-law, her expression gentler than usual, told him that Lucia would have been proud to see how attentive he was to their son. That simple sentence, laden with meaning, felt like a faint ray of reconciliation. Meanwhile, in the corporate world, Arthur's partners were adjusting to the new dynamic. Though the company continued seeking expansion opportunities, it also adopted a more visible social responsibility policy. His foundation's initiatives, backed by his name and reputation, became an intangible asset that lent the company a more human image, drawing investors with similarly aligned values. Certain projects flourished significantly, and while profits might not be as massive as before, they remained steady. Arthur navigated this balance with calm. He found he no longer needed to flaunt his power as much as he needed to enjoy a life centered on raising Jacob and helping other families facing similar challenges. His once inflated pride had turned into a genuine commitment. He learned to celebrate small victories, like Jacob's first time holding himself up with the help of his prosthesis, or the early babbles that almost sounded like Papa. The final scene of this story took place in the mansion's main living room, where the evening sunlight poured through the large windows. Jacob, wearing his adapted prosthetic, was laughing uncontrollably as Arthur held him, swaying him gently from side to side in a constant game of giggles and affection. On a nearby table, a few scattered toys and a forgotten bottle hinted at the baby's busy day. Arthur stopped rocking his son for a moment, gazing at him lovingly. He held him close, pausing to take in the face of this little one who had changed everything. Almost instinctively, his eyes drifted to a photo of Lucia on a nearby shelf, the same image that had been there in their final days together, capturing her unmistakable sparkle in a bright smile. Silence stretched out for a few seconds. Arthur, voice nearly breaking, whispered something unintelligible. Perhaps, "I'm sorry," or "I love you." No one else could make out the exact words, but the simple gesture conveyed that he was expressing both remorse and his boundless commitment to be a very different father than before. In that private moment, the story found its resolution. Everything settled into a new equilibrium. Lucia had died in a tragic accident without hidden plots. Arthur accepted his guilt and was taking slow steps toward redemption. Jacob was now in the care of a father who could offer more than money. He could give the love he had once withheld. Lucia's family and Arthur were building a fragile but promising bridge to reconciliation. The business world, stunned yet adaptable, was adjusting to a renewed leader seeking a balance between wealth and moral responsibility. As evening shadows lengthened and Jacob's laughter filled the house with hope, Arthur sensed that at last he was entering a different chapter, one in which luxury ceased to be his ultimate goal and his love for his son took its rightful place as the strongest reason to keep going. With Lucia's memory present and Jacob's future shining ahead of him, he knew life was giving him the chance to be reborn each day, reconciled with himself and those around him. This story reminds us that behind every mistake lies the possibility of changing course, of healing what was broken by pride through love. When tragedy knocks on our door, it forces us to reevaluate what truly matters, to let go of insatiable ambition and embrace the connections that are most important. In the end, life's true value isn't measured by luxuries or business successes, but by the capacity to ask for forgiveness, to make peace with our past, and to love unconditionally. It is in those gestures of humility and tenderness, even amid tragedy, where we find the power to be reborn, to offer those who follow in our footsteps a brighter, more meaningful future.